Hey guys. Well, summer is coming to an end, and so this video isn't late, you're late. Hey everybody, welcome back to everyone's favorite album review series. This is First Impressions. I'm your host, Gavin, and today, this is definitely not a late video whatsoever, but we are reviewing the Smashing Pumpkins' Aghori Mhori Mei, which is the new album by famed 90s alt-rock group Smashing Pumpkins, which of course needs no introduction as they have a very varied and diverse discography. What do I think of this album? That's what we're going to figure out today, so tune in as we dive into this. But first, I was thinking about reviewing Kanye West's Vultures 2 album, but quite honestly, I would kind of feel gross just even talking about that album because it's bad, don't listen to it. But you guys voted for Smashing Pumpkins anyways, so that makes my life a lot easier. So let's get into this super late review by talking a little bit about the Smashing Pumpkins' past discography and what got them here. Of course, this group needs absolutely no introduction, but I'll give one anyways. They're most known for their two absolutely phenomenal albums in the 90s, being Siamese Dream and, of course, Melancholy and The Infinite Sadness. These are two of the most influential albums for the genre, featuring this very warm guitar tone, a very full sound, phenomenal songwriting, and, of course, the acquired taste, but admittedly powerful vocals of Billy Corgan. And, of course, after these two giant hits, they followed this up with the album Adore, which does have quite a few hits of its own, not nearly as well developed as the previous two, still phenomenal as well. And of course there's this album Gish, which was their debut in '91, I believe it was, which is a pretty good album, but still very rough around the edges. Siamese Dream and Melancholy are of course the two albums which they are associated with the most to this day. Personally, I think that Melancholy and The Infinite Sadness is the better album, being, in honesty, one of my personal favorite double albums of all time. It can be a bit difficult to sit through a double album, but they make it easy on that album. Siamese Dream, still phenomenal, but I do think Melancholy has a bit of an edge. After their breakup in what I believe was 2002-ish, they would eventually get back together in 2006, and since then have been producing pretty not great music, which ranges somewhere between the mediocre and bad for most of those albums. So I was curious to see if they could kind of pull off a career revival. You know, I never turned my light on.
A few minutes later.
Not sure if that did anything, but hopefully it did. But judging by the purely visual aesthetic of this album cover, I kind of gathered that maybe this was going to be a sort of revival, sort of back to basics sort of feel, empty canvas reset sort of album. And I think that's kind of what we get here. We do get definitely what I think has been their most back to basics album since that reunion. It sort of has the reminiscence of older Smashing Pumpkins albums, minus of course their original bassist Darsky Retsky, but you do have that classic sound, that classic production, which is emulated pretty accurately with some of course changes because you don't just want to repeat the same thing over, but it definitely does echo back to that older music pretty well. As of right now, this band is consisting of permanent members Billy Corgan, of course, James Iha, the original guitarist, and Jimmy Chamberlain, the original drummer. As of right now, they do not have a bassist. Billy Corgan is filling in on bass duties for this album. They have recently expanded to have a large touring group, having guitarist Kiki Wango now on the group there. I think a 6-member touring group as of right now. However, none of those touring members are credited on this album, it's just the core 3. Another interesting thing is there's no producer listed on the album, but that leads me to believe that Corgan was the main producer on this as well. He is a multi-trick pony, so that would be right up his alley. But without that original bassist Darcy Retsky, who of course hasn't been in the band for a while, as Billy Corgan and Darcy have been on this weird decades-long feud, I was interested to see if that kind of matters a lot to the original sound of Smashing Pumpkins and creating that nostalgia, that feel. And so we are going to investigate how cohesive this album is as we get into the track list. Let's do it right now. The album is a pretty standard length, being about 44 minutes, 10 tracks, nothing too crazy long, nothing too crazy short, pretty average length, but track 1 is called Edin, and I gave Edin an 8. I liked it. Edin is just a pretty awesome, like, almost alt-rock sweet sort of feel, and it features a lot of religious subject matter. It's also pretty veiled, as the lyricism doesn't really give away too much of its tricks. This analogy-heavy style isn't really my favorite for this group, because I think it's just veiled a little bit too heavily to the point where it's just trying to do too much, and it feels almost nonsensical for this group, which doesn't really fit into the style of the music. I think there's a disconnect there. They certainly aren't bad lyrics, they're just a little bit over the top. But I really think that there's a really cohesive mix here. Mixing engineer Andrew Sheps, who has worked on projects for countless bands and artists, has doing the mixing here, and it's pretty phenomenal. Every instrument pretty much pops, and I really appreciated just the overall production and sound that was curated here. There were times when the vocals get a little bit buried. I think the vocals could have been mixed a little bit better, but it's not a huge detriment to the song. Overall, I'm always impressed when a song with a length that is like over 5 minutes, such as this, which nears 7, can pull off not getting stale and staying interesting. There's not a ton of distinct sections to this song, but dynamically, there's enough change-ups and enough switches and enough interesting tweaks made throughout the song to keep it fresh for the entire duration, which is no easy feat. When you have a song that's that long, it is difficult to keep it fresh, but it stays fresh throughout. There's a couple notable issues I had with it, but it stays as a pretty dang good song. The second track is called Pentagrams. I gave it a 7. Pentagrams kind of shifts a little bit and has some interesting allusions to classical literature, some Shakespearean references in there at places, and even a reference to Shakespeare's Tempest, which is one of my favorite Shakespeare works, but that's a story for another time. The lyricism I enjoy a little bit more here, as it seems to be a little bit more consistently themed, a little bit more centered than on that opening song, and the production is, in my opinion, still pretty great. I have 2 major complaints on this song, though. For one, Billy's pitch correction or auto-tune is fairly obvious. You could hear this very electronic quality to his voice, which I think really needed a second look in the studio, just because it sounds quite fake. I feel like part of the appeal of Billy Corgan's voice is that it's very natural, it's very unabashedly unique, and I feel like when you add some pitch correction that is super obvious in that way and not embracing subtlety, you really risk losing that uniqueness, that drive. The reason people love Billy Corgan is just because of that uniqueness. My other complaint is a little bit more minor. The synth intro, it feels a bit disconnected to the rest of the song. There's no callback, there's no riff that emulates it later on in the song. It just feels like it's something that's very detached from the last 6 minutes of the song. You kind of just have this weird, like, 30-second intro that does not remotely get implemented later through riffs, through melodies, through whatever, and it just feels a bit out of place. It's still a good song, and I enjoyed listening to it. There's just a couple issues that can't really be ignored. Track number 3 is called Sighommi. I don't know what Sighommi means. I didn't bother to look it up. I tried looking up the title of this album, by the way, Aghori Mhori Mei. However, I couldn't really find anyone that agreed. I got a lot of different answers. Apparently Latin is a funky language, but if anyone knows what the hell this means, please let me know. But Sighommi opens up with the best riff on the album so far, and the mixing isn't quite my favorite on this track like it is on other tracks, but it still is quite good. It doesn't overstay its welcome, as it sits at a very digestible 3 minutes long, adding for a nice, quick experience, just kind of put some thematically centered, honestly, a little bit of filler in there and call it a day. But it doesn't feel like filler, it just kind of, it isn't quite as epic or to the grand scale of the first 2, but it certainly is still a pretty good song. I really respect songs that are just quick and fun and get out of the way quick. The classical literary references continue here, as you have more references to things like that and also mythology, and it continues to be a pretty solid rock song, adding on to what is so far a pretty good album. Pentecost I did not dig whatsoever, unfortunately. I only gave it a 3. It just didn't grab me that well. The vocals are in my least favorite Billy Corgan style, which is this very airy, breathy, sort of fake and odd feel to it. He has been airy on good songs before. For instance, he's a little bit airy on Today, on Siamese Dream, but here he just does not execute so well. The vocals just get very corny, very superficial, very odd and out of place for an album that is very religiously and mythologically and literary centered. The soundscape is also just very indulgent to a degree where it kind of feels cheap and overblown. It just feels like a very lacking, disappointing attempt to recreate Tonight Tonight. It's not abysmal, it's not one of the worst things I've heard this year or anything like that. It's just, there are several problems with it and not much making up for it, because it's just too overblown for me to take it seriously whatsoever. Track 5 is called War Dreams of Itself. I give it an 8. Continuing the religious and mythological theming, this album kind of gets back to those exciting, back-to-basics sort of ideas, with some solid, albeit a bit basic riffs, and a really interesting feel with these interesting, like, triplets over a 4/4 feel, which kind of makes this interesting kind of 12/8 polymeter sort of thing. And it made for an interesting and unique feel, which I really appreciated. The vocals are also on this track finally sounding mixed and tuned correctly, very subtle with the auto-tune, very mixed and very well, still piercing, and I really was looking for that for a while, so it's nice to finally see that to a proper degree. And when you have a good riff, good mix, good everything, it adds together to be a pretty solid alt-rock song. Track number 6 was alright. I gave it a 6. While the instruments continue to be mixed really well, Billy's voice kind of drops off again in this album, just being not pitch-corrected flatteringly at all. It's a very unappealing sound. The worst thing about this song, though, is just the absolutely really corny key change ups. There's a lot of them, and I don't see why they exist. They don't help to move the song along. They don't help to develop a theme, add tension, add really anything, and I don't know why they're there other than to make me think back to my musical theater days and kind of cringe a little bit. While I feel like there's a well-written song here with interesting lyricism, it's just marred by a lot of these unfortunate problems, which hold it back quite a lot. Those key changes just don't flatter, the pitch correcting isn't great, and those things just really hold it back for me and keep it from being that interesting, powerful song that I think it can be if it was just handled a little bit better. Still a decent song, but some notable problems. Track number 7 is not called 7, it's called 999, but it did get a 9 from me. I like this song quite a lot. This is easily the best true alt-rock song on this album. It doesn't have the problems of previous tracks where his vocals are too buried or too piercing or too whatever, but his vocals are quite strong and I like them a lot here. There's also the most interesting riffs on this album, being some really nice catchy melodies and stuff like that. And honestly, this would fit in as a deep cut on one of their older records from the 90s. It's a pretty awesome track all around, and it not only has a great riff, but also some really well put together sections with this nice cohesiveness and flow and a development that makes sense. And so I really like this song quite a lot. Goeth the Fall, however, I did not dig so much. I only gave it a 5. It's very meh, and I just didn't find much special about it. It's very Smashing Pumpkins with that main guitar riff. It's not a particularly memorable riff, unfortunately, and Billy's vocals are annoyingly back to being not so great anymore. Jimmy Chamberlain is also uncharacteristically boring on this degree, and it's not to serve the song. He could have done more interesting stuff, but for some reason he's very simple to the degree of boredom, and his drumming, most importantly, does not help to develop the flow or the theming or the development of this track whatsoever. And so there's just a couple things that hold it back from being decent, so that's why I gave it that 5. Track 9 is called Sicarus. I gave it a 6. While it's better than Goeth the Fall, it's still a little forgettable. A lot of the problems don't carry on in the same capacity as they did on the last track, but they are still present. The riffs just aren't as memorable as other riffs in this album, and it kind of falls into this forgettable group. It's fine. There's just far better riffs and far better tracks and far better ideas on this album elsewhere, and it's just kind of there. Track 10 is called Murnau. I liked it a lot. I gave it a 9. It was quite nice. It's my personal favorite on this album, clearly, as it has a 9 rating. I think it has the slight edge over 999. 999 is the better solid alt-rock song, but Murnau is the most epic and fulfilled song on this album. The opening piano bit is a little bit bland. I would have liked a little bit more flavor in there, but about a minute in, it starts building really well with these interesting string sections and some horns that come in later. It's not produced in the grandest way, but it's very intimate, very feels big, but also feels personal, sort of thing, which is kind of hard to pull off and not have it be a confusing song. After the midway cutoff, it settles into this really interesting groove. The horns cut out and the strings kind of simplify down, but it's still pretty great. The last 2 minutes are honestly really phenomenal, and the finest 2 minutes of music on the album, which it's great that they're saving it for the grand finale. I like that a lot. And this is some of the best work on the album, just having these really warm, grand, yet also tasteful string sections, but still really nice complementary bass lines with this nice warm tone. The drums are not overdoing it, but also serving the song super, super well. And James Iha, per normal, always sounds great on the guitar. And there's very simple, yet very melodic vocal lines, which are very memorable from Billy Corgan. There's a lot of factors and players here in this track, and they all work really well together to make a really cohesive and interesting song. With one or two weak transitions, and the opening 30 seconds being not terribly interesting, I won't give it that full 10, but I will say this is a pretty phenomenal alt-rock track, and I would recommend it to anybody. And I honestly think it's probably the best song that the Smashing Pumpkins have crafted up in recent memory. What do I think? What do I think of this album? I think it is the best Smashing Pumpkin album post-breakup. That doesn't say a ton, seeing as how, after that 2006 reunion, they haven't put out much that's been worth anything. But this is a new direction for the band. It's very much going back to their roots, going back to what made them popular, what made them successful, and kind of taking that, sitting on it for a little bit, and then deciding to go in a new path off of that. After they've struggled to find a decent sound, a decent mix, really a decent anything for a while, I think they've finally found something here which, while it's not perfect and there are a lot of problems with it, I think if they develop this idea in their next project or next two projects, they can really have some great stuff and maybe see a renaissance soon. It's not on the same level as Siamese Dream and Melancholy, not by any means, of course, and honestly, I even think it's not quite on the same level as Adore, but it certainly has a good amount of merit. The production here is always nice. I'm liking the way the instruments are locking in together, and I think that Andrew Sheps is going to be a good mixer to roll with going forward. Of course, we already knew that, seeing his discography, but it's good to see that he works well with the Smashing Pumpkins and they're very cohesive together. And I think this back-to-basics sound, again, of just Iha, Chamberlain, and Corgan working together is really what this band needs at a time where they were starting to slip. Billy Corgan has done a good job filling on bass for Darcy in her stead, and I think that unless they find that they need someone going forward, I think Corgan on bass is a good way to roll for now. And with the positives out of the way now, let's get into the things that I didn't like. It's going to be some repetition, but that's okay. Of course, I'll keep this short, but Billy Corgan's pitch correction on a lot of these tracks is not good. Unfortunately, on the tracks where he isn't pitch corrected to a disgusting degree, and it's done just right, he's oftentimes buried in the mix, so you can't hear him anyways. So I think there needs to be a serious reevaluation of how the vocals are handled in the mixes and in the production and in the studio. Maybe they need to bring in a second opinion specifically to look at the vocals and figure out how to process those correctly, because Andrew Sheps is hitting most places, but not on those vocals. So maybe they need a second person back in the booth working on that. Because when they're quiet, they're too quiet, and when they're loud, they don't sound good. But of course, that second person stuff that I was recommending, that's entirely speculation. I don't know what it actually needs. And while there are certainly standout tracks in this album, most notably 999 and Murnau, there are problems which hold a weight over almost all of these tracks, which are definitely going to factor into my opinion at the end of the day, because they are consistent problems happening on nearly every track. Another major complaint is that for the most part, the riffs and melodies are rather unfocused. There are a couple good riffs, there's about 3 or 4 good riffs, but the vocal melodies are rather forgettable, which is unfortunate because I find the lyrics to be quite good. I find that this look back to kind of veiled analogies combined with the mythology and the Shakespeare and the classic literature is a really nice combination which complements each other really well. But however, I think that the melodies are just too forgettable. On this album, you will not find a great hummable chorus like you hear on Bullet with Butterfly Wings, you know, like everyone can hum that. Or a great guitar riff like you hear on Today, which is simple, hummable, and yet very memorable. You don't really find a ton of that as they lean a little bit more into their metal side, which I think is a bit of a mistake. I think they need to kind of tone it back, go back to those simple yet memorable and poppy riffs. Because almost none of these songs, good as they are, possess that sort of earworm quality such as Today and Bullet with Butterfly Wings have. So while this comes together as a nice sounding rock record that honestly is some of the best work by this band in years, there's quite a couple problems on this record which I would like to see remedied on a future project. It's a really good start to what could be in the future a career revival for this group, but until then I am satisfied but not particularly impressed, which is why I'm feeling a middle 6 on this album, because there's promise here, but not the most flattering execution. But hey, Thanks for watching this super late review. I've been your host, Gavin. If you want to vote on future album reviews and what I review every week, you can go to my Instagram and vote there. But with my second year of college just around the corner, that could decrease my productivity on these videos. But just in case it is a while until my next upload, make sure you subscribe so that you don't miss it just in case. Thanks for watching, guys. See ya.